Okay, so let's get going with the first one. So the first one is develop the project charter. It makes sense. Where would that go on the map? And we would say, well, of course, develop the project charter going kind of left to right and top to bottom. We'll say that the project charter will go up here. Now, what else is in initiating? And this is interesting because it's in chapter 13 of the PMBOK. So it's almost towards the end, but identify the stakeholders. What they probably mean is analyze the stakeholders, but you understand the concept. We identify the stakeholders, we analyze their power and their concern, and we place it here. And we call this initiating as a group. Okay, then we have an interesting thing that happens. You might have heard of this thing called develop the project management plan. Now, the project management plan is a kind of container for all the information that we will plan, and therefore it's called the project management plan. So we need it at the beginning to tell us how to plan, and we need it at the end to capture all the things that we have planned, the schedule, the budget, the risks, the resources. So what we're going to do for the moment is put it here, and you'll start to see the numbers here. Now, one of the things that needs to go into that is what's called the rules of the road, or we call them organizational process assets, OPA for short. So organizational process assets are going to be things like, how do we do scope management? Okay, how do we do it within the organization? What are our rules? What are our templates? What are our metrics? Do we have any checklists? Now, plan cost management and plan schedule management, okay? So we have plan schedule management and we have plan cost management. Now together, this is kind of a building block of how we are going to run the project. Remember, there's no scope in the scope management plan, there's no schedule in the schedule management plan, and there's no cost in the cost management plan. This is just the rules of the road for how we're going to plan it, and then of course, how we're going to execute and even manage changes to it. But it's important to see that the project management plan is both the beginning and the end of planning. In the beginning, it tells us how to plan, and at the end, it captures all the information in planning. Of course, then we can move quite quickly into the three main ones on scope. And so the first one in scope is going to be collect the requirements. It makes sense. We collect the requirements from the stakeholders in accordance with the rules of the road, in this case, plan scope management. So we have this one, collect requirements. Now, it's such an interesting topic because if we get this one wrong, it's going to cause us a lot of problems over here, obviously. So we collect the requirements. Now we have to define what's in and what's out of scope. So we define the scope, we produce a scope statement. It tells us what's in, what's out, based on the requirements that we have got from the stakeholders. And we might use a Moscow analysis or something to help us there. Now we create the work breakdown structure, and this is the first baseline. So now you see relatively quickly, we've gone from the why into what it is that we're going to do. So without getting involved in the schedule or the budget or the risks, you can see that we go from why we're doing it, who's interested, who's impacted, who has influence. How do we do project management in the organization? What challenges, what constraints, what things do we have to deal with? Then we collect the requirements from the stakeholders. We define what's in and out, and this could lead to a lot of storming and conflict, as you can imagine. And then we agree on what is the scope. So that's very logical. PMBOK has this flow that then says, now, once I have the work breakdown structure, I can do a lot of other things. I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And for those of you with a sharp mind, you'll see that the colors are the process group, but the numbers refer to the chapter in the PMBOK. So it makes it easy for me to do this. I will then say we need to define the activities. Now, an activity is a subset of the work breakdown structure. So it's a decomposition or a further decomposition, and therefore it would go there. Now we can do two things with those activities. And the first one, for our purposes, is to sequence the activities. And we say this before this, or this in parallel with this. And so we will put leads and lags perhaps, and we'll represent that in some kind of a network diagram. And then we estimate the activity durations. If you remember, durations is not the same as effort. And therefore we look at analogous, parametric, bottom up, and 3-point estimating, but they will go there. So now we have this idea that the two things with the activities have been done, and therefore we can develop the schedule. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Whether you're a schedule or a schedule, depending on which part of the world you're from, you cannot develop the schedule until you've done these things. So it's kind of a straight line all the way to here. Now, I suppose in parallel with that, and depending on the type of project you're working on, you need to estimate the costs. And for some, cost is a driver, for some, schedule is a driver, for some, quality is a driver. You understand that idea. But we can estimate the costs based on the work breakdown structure, and then we can aggregate those costs together and put them in the timeline based on the schedule, and we will determine the budget. Apologies, that one was stolen by my dog, but you get the idea. We determine the budget there. Okay, so the budget is the allocation of the money over time, and therefore it comes from the schedule. Now, I've gone out of sequence a little bit here because I want to include risks, because the risks obviously have an effect on the schedule and the budget, because we need to put in a contingency. So the first thing we do in risk is plan risk management. That makes sense. How are we going to do risk? And you could have done that earlier, of course, but we'll put it there and identify the risks. Now, this is the most important one for me, because if we don't identify the risks, well, then everything else is of no use. We'll just have an issue over here. So we have a risk, which is the matches that may cause us fires. And so you can see in the background, there is some information that might help us as well, but that's for a different class. So we have the matches may cause us fires. We identify the risks based on a multitude of techniques that will help us to do it. Now, once we've identified the risks, we need to prioritize them. And we have two ways of doing that, what's called qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. Now, you can do one or the other. You don't really need to do both, but if you can say it's a high, medium, low risk, and high risk is something unacceptable, or you can actually quantify the risks and have some metric system using some kind of a simulation or Monte Carlo analysis or something. But basically, we have two systems here, which then allow us to do this plan risk responses. So we plan the risk responses, remember, avoid, accept, transfer, but also importantly, opportunities and threats. So we can do this for opportunities, or we can do it for threats. And you can see there's going to be a lot of information here in terms of outputs and tools and techniques. For the moment, we're just doing the processes. We're just looking at initiating and planning, and then we'll take a break and move on to the other areas. Okay. This will be relatively straightforward now. You'll see that we have to plan quality management. So plan quality management makes sense. We need to know what standards we have to achieve and whether we'll be able to achieve those, what metrics we'll be using, but basically plan quality management. Now we have two in resourcing, and this is a relatively new one to PMBOK 6. So we plan resource management, and then we estimate the activity resources. Now for those of you who know, that used to be up here in PMBOK 5, but we've moved it down here. But basically, I should draw another line. It might become too complicated, but we have plan resource management and estimate activity resources. Big change here, we're using the word resources, not human resources. Okay, so just make sure you catch on that. This is estimating helicopters and conference rooms and bandwidth, just as much as you're estimating humans, okay? So we plan resource management, estimate activity resources. Now, of course, we have to plan communications, the data that we're going to get, the information we're going to share, the knowledge that we need, and the wisdom will actually ultimately end up as expert judgment. So there you go, plan communications management, okay? We have plan procurement management, okay? Plan procurement management, which is going to be all of the outsourcing, anything we're buying from outside of the organization, what type of contract, the statements of work if you want. So we're going to be looking at that as well. And it's also called the make or buy analysis. So that's where we do the make or buy analysis. Now we do that based on the work, obviously. So we have the work and then we say, should we make it? Should we buy it? And then we have to decide what type of contract. And ultimately, we will manage that over here. But here's where we start to identify it. The last one we have in planning, which is called planned stakeholder engagement. Important to notice here, it's planned stakeholder engagement, not management. So the engagement, if you remember, unaware, resistant, neutral, supporting, leading. So that's a very important one for us. So we've identified the stakeholders here and we plan their engagement here. And obviously we're going to do the engagement and we're going to control the engagement or monitor, in our case, the engagement. But basically what you've seen now is that we have this thing called planning and initiating. So initiating is why, planning is how. That's it. That's it. The one thing I do want you to see is that we have the project management plan here, but then ultimately we have to put in the schedule, put in the budget, put in the risks, put in all of these things, the communications, the procurements, and the engagement strategy. We put them all in here, and then we execute that and we control against that. So the project management plan is both the beginning, where it is a container for the rules of the road, and the end, where it is a container for all of the plans that we're going to use. Okay, when you come back, we're going to look at executing, and then we're going to look at controlling and closing. And then we'll move on to the outputs and the tools and techniques. And then you'll have a better sense of the whole of the PMBOK.